The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional therapy or mental health services. If you are experiencing emotional distress or need support, please consult a licensed mental health professional.
Episode 1 of Trauma Unpacked, An Introduction to Trauma, with clinical psychologists Deborah Olusola and Nisha Rodgerson.
Welcome to Conversations on the Couch, a podcast fostering safe and sound conversations for the mind. My name is Deborah Olusola.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nisha Rodgerson, a clinical psychologist here at the Couch.
Yes, welcome, Nisha. So, we are starting our very first podcast, and we're officially launching the trauma series, Trauma Unpacked. Right? I think there's a lot of us that have gone through some kind of trauma one way or another, and I think this topic it's going to be very interesting, very educational, and I'm hoping that a lot of our listeners and viewers will get some kind of insight and some kind of help, or at least reach out for help if possible. And I guess in preparing for this podcast, it just reminded me of something that I've been through in my childhood, and maybe I can share a bit of that. When the 9/11 happened, I remember how it was on every news channel at that particular point in time, and they were replaying the same clips over and over on how the plane crashed into the Twin Towers, right? And I remembered that first night I could not sleep. I could not sleep, and I was young at that time.
Fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just recall, every time a plane would fly over our home, I felt so unsettled. My heart was racing. I would literally unlock the door, go outside, check the sky, make sure that where is this plane and that this plane is not going to crash into our house. I was so terrified, and nobody knew. I would do it in such a way that it would just look like I'm just going out for fresh air. But it became so difficult, especially at night, because I felt like, how do I get out? The whole place has been locked by the parentals and so on and so forth. But I would sit there and my heart was racing. I was out of breath. I felt like I was breaking out into a sweat. So just in terms of our topic, right? Many people experience trauma in so many different ways, but how do we understand what trauma is? What is it? Like how can people identify that they've been through a traumatic situation?
So I think, defining trauma it's complex, just like trauma itself.
Yeah.
But I think it's quite important to understand that there are, different definitions in terms of trauma. They're the big traumas that we all know, right? The capital T traumas. So that's your hijacking, or the violent abuse, the rape. Those capital T traumas, we all sort of in our minds can put that into the category of okay, this was a really negative, stressful life event that had an impact on me and sits with me, and that I probably need to deal with, and that I struggle to cope with. I felt very out of control. But there are smaller T traumas, right? Yeah. Where we look at the neglect in childhood, or the conversations that weren't had with us, and we could feel things were going on in the household. The divorce of our parents, the school teacher that told us we weren't good enough. Yeah. That right there these other things that happen to us in our life, and I think what you've said is so important, in that we all in some way in our life will experience a traumatic event, and it's not necessarily the capital T trauma, right? The big grief, the big loss, the robbery, but it's important to understand that any event that takes place in our life that made us feel stressed, out of control, frightened, maybe we had a physical bodily response to it, maybe we dissociated for some times to try and cope with it, all of that is trauma. So I think our definition of trauma needs to be quite broad when we're talking about it, and we need to understand that each person is also going to respond differently. And so that's the one definition, but I really like how Gabor Mate puts it, where he says it's not necessarily the traumatic event itself. So it's not the thing that happened, but it's what happens inside of us because of the event that happened. So we experienced it as traumatic on the inside in some kind of way.
Yeah.
We internalized it in some kind of way. We struggled with it in some kind of way. And that is what the trauma is.
Yeah.
And that is what we sit with afterwards. Because the event has come and gone,
Yeah.
possibly, right?
Absolutely.
Or it's a prolonged event that happened over many years. But even if it's not ongoing or it's not taking place right now, we're still sitting with something because it changed something inside of us. And that is the essence, I think, of what we sit with in terms of trauma.
And I appreciate what you said in terms of it, the definition being quite broad, because when I look at it and I look at my experience, I used to wonder, is there something wrong with me? Why am I the only one reacting? Because I mean, I understood I was in a different continent. I didn't necessarily see it, I was watching it from TV, but I had this different experience compared to my siblings, compared to my parents. And it just makes me think about how we all respond differently. We all have these different reactions. Like I explained, my heart was racing, shortness of breath. Everyone has these different experiences. But what contributes to that? What are the factors that makes me, react to one situation compared to how you would react to another situation?
So let's use the example that you've given, right? So I feel that a lot of people respond to a traumatic event based upon possibly their history, right? The kinds of conversations that they've had, maybe their age. Age plays a big factor, right? Because when we're little, we can't comprehend what's happening. That in and of itself adds a layer of like, how do I talk about this? I'm confused. Is this normal? Those are the questions that you grappled with. And I think that there's so many factors that in terms of how we respond to trauma, our perceived level of social support, possibly, the structure of support around us. So say, for instance, your family had sat down with you and gone, okay, guys, so this is what's happened. Let's debrief. Let's talk about it. How are you feeling? What was your reaction? Normalizing it for you, possibly. So opening up that space to feel, to have the conversation, to validate whatever's going on for you. Possibly your response might have been a bit different. You might not have felt as alone, or you might not have felt as isolated in it, sneaking around, trying to check whether the plane's coming. So I think we respond differently according to a lot of factors. Some of those factors are definitely how much support we have, the resources we have around us. Do you have access to a psychologist? Can you speak to someone about this? Do you feel that it would be acceptable or okay to speak about it? Obviously, there's also, resilience that comes in. There's a part of our brain that literally shuts down when we're in trauma, that we're not making, reasonable, rational decisions. We're not really able to process a lot of our own emotions, so we might need assistance with that. Is assistance available to us? What's going on there? Culture has a lot to do with how we respond to trauma.
It's a big one. What's
culturally appropriate in the situation? Am I allowed to express this, or is this something that is quite stigmatized in my culture? There's so many conversations that we can open up about that, but for today I'll keep it brief.
No, but thank you for that. I think even what you said in terms of how it's been spoken about, I think it's so important in how we I think process and understand,
conceptualize
what we went through. Because especially as children, I'm just thinking in terms of me being in practice and what I've heard and had to help and support my clients with, is that sometimes you can't talk about these things, one way or another. The primary caregiver either doesn't want to talk about it, or they shut them down, shut them out, or they tell them you'll be fine, but what is a child meant to do when they've had this experience? It's a personal, individual experience, but what do you do when nobody wants to talk to you about it?
Such a hard one, right? Because we're sitting in this emotional dysregulated state where our nervous system, we're in fight, flight, freeze. We don't know what to do. And then what I often also see that's so interesting, especially in children, is they sit with so much shame.
Yes.
Right? So the trauma and the shame. And the shame that they sit with is so heavy, and it makes them feel more alone, more isolated, like they can't talk about it. So the first thing that I think we need to do, whether it be as a parent, as a friend, as a practitioner, we need to start talking about the shame.
Yeah.
And we need to just find a way to navigate that first.
Yeah.
And once we've taken that heaviness away, and we're able to open up the conversation around whatever it is that they've experienced, we'll start to see a bit of a shift.
Yeah.
But often kids, especially, like, they sit with so much shame around the issue or the trauma, and often it's not their shame to carry.
No, absolutely,
Yeah.
and funny enough, they are often misunderstood when they are reacting with like the anger outbursts or, like you said, isolating, and they're further
The
shamed.
behaviors.
Yes, they're further shamed because of that. Like, why, for example, you would hear parents saying, "Why are you so moody?" Not understanding that this child has gone through something. Instead of sitting with them, engaging them, inviting them into some form of dialogue to be able to help them through that process. But I think also, just in terms of the way we react to these traumas, I think it's just interesting how our body absorbs what we witnessed or what we heard. Like I said, my heart was racing, I was having shortness of breath, but sometimes it gets so severe. I've heard people fainting. People have actually passed out. What other reactions do people have when it comes to witnessing or experiencing some kind of traumatic event?
Right. So you're talking about something so important in terms of trauma, because I think people focus on the emotional state, which is rightfully so, but the mind and the body are so connected. And we often see that in trauma. There's so much research that's been done on it. The body keeps the score, like foundation of what we're talking about. And when you look at how trauma manifests in the body, I often say, like, it shows up as our messenger at first. Our gut health is affected. The way that we're able to process our thoughts is affected. Memory is affected. I mean, that's one of the first things we see, right? And then there are flashbacks, and there are all kinds of things that happen to us, but our body is holding a lot of that. And our nervous system is certainly dysregulated when we experience trauma. And I mean, we know this, right? That's the heart racing and the palpitations and the fight, flight, freeze that it goes into. To be able to come out of that trauma state, we have to understand what the body's holding and how to release it and how to come back to a non-trauma state, right? And I think there are a lot of tools out there that we can use to do this, but we have to get that help, that extra support, that education around what we need to do for ourselves to become regulated again and to feel like we've come online in that way again, because the body protectively, it's very protective. It has to do this when we experience trauma. So we also honor that. We honor the fact that we've gone into this state in a very protective way, where the mind and the body couldn't cope with everything going on. So we had to dissociate, or we had to, we had to experience the shutdown in some kind of way. But to then honor that, hold it, recognize it, and then realize that we're going to have to come back to some kind of ground zero again. I think that's so important, and everybody's body responds differently. So that's also another thing that, I mean, we can open up at a later stage, because it's a lot.
No, very true. I mean, such a huge topic for us to be able to tackle so many different, I guess, subtopics within it. But in terms of you saying people, working through it, through that the different traumas, I think there's still some difficulties that people have. I often hear in practice, like, what's the point? Or another common saying is, it happened such a long time ago. Why do I need to open that box? And I want to know your thoughts in that. Like, should we talk about our traumas? Should we deal with it? Can we deal with it? If it happened so long ago, or if somebody did something to us and they passed away, like, how am I going to get through it? That's one of those are the common questions I tend to get in therapy. But I want to hear your thoughts.
So firstly, on what you said, like, I think it's so natural to not want to open Pandora's box sometimes. I think, we do tend to avoid the things that have caused us pain or that have caused us hurt, but I think what we sometimes grapple with and what we don't quite understand is that if we don't go there and we don't gain some understanding and awareness around it, the triggers that lie there will remain And they'll show up in our lives in different ways, in our relationships, in our parenting, so this becomes our healing journey that we have to take responsibility for, and that's hard. Like, let's put it out there, it's brave, it's hard,
it's scary,
it's so scary. None of us really want to do it, but at the end of the day, when we go there and when we start to heal, and sometimes this is the thing, the healing isn't linear. We don't come to therapy and we talk about it a couple of times and then we're miraculously healed. When there are pain points, when there's trauma, sometimes we have to revisit it. Sometimes we have to go back there. Sometimes we have to do the work again. Sometimes we have to have a different conversation. And that's what makes it tricky. And that I think people, so rightfully so. I mean, people will come to you and they'll be like, oh no, like, I don't need to talk about this anymore. I don't need to. But in that, you're also invalidating your own experience. And that's possibly what was done to you in the trauma itself. Yeah. So it becomes really important in your healing journey for you to actually validate and sit with that and honor it and work through it. And I think, healing is always possible, but it's a journey. It's something that you have to decide on. It's a choice. It's a lot of work. You've got to have capacity for it. Yes. So you're also sitting with all of that and you're grappling with all of that. And I think honoring that's very important too. Yeah. But no, trauma does not need to be your resting place. There is a way to get through it, to move through it, to heal from it. But I completely understand the resistance because that is what causes pain, and those are pain points. And who wants to push on a pain point, right?
No one.
It's not
absolutely
not
no one.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, and I think from what you just said, one is never always really ready. But you use the word capacity. You create the capacity. You take that initiative, that first step. And if you have a really good therapist, they would move at a pace that is, that works for you. And I think that
comfortable.
It is comfortable. But I think there are certain factors that prevent people from, I guess, reaching out and seeking help. I know there are some misconceptions about, trauma, and I guess. Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions that I'm aware of is that, you only experience trauma if it was really bad, and people are often giving those examples, like you said, the capital T's, like so it has to be a hijack, it has to be, being held at gunpoint. Right. But there's so many misconceptions that I think that really hold people back from dealing with their trauma sometimes, or there's just some misunderstandings of trauma.
So I think that some of the misconceptions around trauma definitely creates this barrier in terms of seeking assistance, getting the help that we need, especially around things that we don't necessarily deem trauma. So that's why this conversation is so important, because I think that there are things that happen to us in life that we're like, you know what, we'll just deal with it we'll deal with it when we're a parent, or we'll cope, or and what we don't understand is the impact that it's actually had on us. Yeah. And I think that, so one of the red flags for me is like, if you have experienced like a bodily experience of any kind, like it's sitting in your body, you feel dysregulated, that is your messenger. Like there's something here. There's something here that you need to look at. Yeah. The other thing, in terms of back to your question, like myths and stigmas around trauma, is trauma doesn't necessarily have to result in PTSD to be trauma. Right? Those are the capital T traumas that we defined in the beginning. But there's sometimes, complex trauma, multiple experiences with parents, with loved ones, in a marriage, infidelity. Yeah. There's so many other factors that come into play here when we talk about trauma. And I feel like in terms of breaking the stigma, breaking the myths, normalizing it, we need to start understanding that not all trauma is capital T trauma. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, trauma in and of itself doesn't always have to be experienced like directly by the person.
Mm.
It can be a vicarious experience.
Yeah.
It can be the experience of a loved one that you're exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that I think people don't always understand, because like, oh, but it didn't happen to you.
Mm.
I'm like, but they've internalized it. It's what happened
Yes.
inside of them.
Yeah. Mm.
So there's so many misconceptions and myths, and I don't know if you can think of any others.
One of the ones I hear is that if you've gone through a trauma, you're traumatized for life.
Yes.
For example, like
Yes,
they
good
say
one.
it's unending. You know,
Mm.
you're going to be in that constant state. There's no help.
There's no healing.
There's no healing for you.
Yeah.
And no, that's not, necessarily true.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to what you said. It depends on how a person chooses to go about it, right? And the
Yeah.
kind of support
What
and the
they've
help
got.
they're going to get.
Yeah.
It makes a whole, it
Yeah.
can make a huge difference
Yeah.
on how that person's life is shaped post the trauma. So you're not going to remain in that traumatic state forever.
Right.
You know, and I think
Right.
sometimes from where that misconception comes, I think it's sometimes from, for example, those who were in the army and didn't get help. We often do see them still, going through these symptoms.
Yeah, the
of
flashbacks.
the flashbacks,
PTSD,
and it really doesn't stop. But
right.
you do have those severe cases because people don't necessarily get help or seek help.
Right.
But it is an assumption that if you have a trauma that you'll never get better.
Right.
No, it's not necessarily true.
Trauma actually often results in coping and resilience.
Yeah. Okay.
More so than we see the PTSD, or we see the most people that experience some kind of trauma in their life eventually heal and move on, and they become quite resilient. So it's not that every time there's a trauma or that you experience trauma, you're going to be stuck in it.
Yeah.
Right? Stuck at that age of trauma, stuck in that phase, emotionally dysregulated forever. Most responses to trauma are actually resilient.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. No, that's something we can learn from, actually. Yeah. So I think with these misconceptions, I'm hoping that people will be able to understand that there's more to what meets the eye, and really it is an individual experience, as we've been discussing throughout this particular session. But I think there are different books, I guess, that, some people love books. I think I'm one of them, or I'm trying to get back into the habit of reading.
Yeah.
I think, some people could benefit from reading books, related to trauma, understanding their traumas. And I have a book here that was written by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry. It's called What Happened to You. Very interesting book. I've just started reading it. And what they talk about is, I think they're trying to introduce a narrative shift of, instead of asking, like, what's wrong with you, they rather prefer that people ask what happened to you. And that changes the way people can talk about what it is that they've gone through in terms of their trauma. And so they do explore a lot about what happened in early childhood and how it influences the way people become as a result. So I think it's a very interesting book. If people,
it's like the predispositions to trauma, and
and I started reading it, and I'm so captivated by it.
Well, hopefully our listeners will
so it's
grab hold of it.
So it's called What Happened to You. If anybody wants to read it, by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. I believe he's a psychiatrist.
Yes.
So do you have any books as well that you would like others to
so many
consider?
Trauma. So trauma is such a complex topic, and it's very broad. So obviously books on complex trauma, there are books on the body-mind connection in trauma, which is the one that I spoke about earlier. So Bessel van der Kolk writes about The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, amazing book. Amazing.
So
book.
very foundational, you need to read that one first. And then obviously Gabor Mate, which I absolutely adore. He writes The Myth of Normal. So he talks about trying to deal with trauma in this toxic culture, this isolating culture where we really feel alone and we don't have this sense of universality, and how to talk about trauma and how to shift that narrative. So he talks about that in The Myth of Normal. And then he also writes a book, which I think is sort of a follow-on from this The Body Keeps the Score, where it's called When the Body Says No.
Okay.
And he talks about the link between trauma and disease.
Yeah.
So how like autoimmune diseases and certain chronic illnesses actually manifest in the body because of trauma. Yes.
Sounds like a good
Yeah,
read.
it
I
is.
would definitely look at it.
It is. It's called When the Body Says No, and it, underneath it's like the hidden cost of stress. Right. So it's stress, trauma, how the body responds. And he dives into the autoimmune disease phenomena that we're seeing all over the world at the moment, and how he believes that that's unprocessed trauma. And I think that that's so powerful because that's a conversation we need to be having next.
Oh, most definitely. And we've got so much time for that in our next series. Yeah, but thank you for those books. And I hope our listeners will be able to have an opportunity to go through them, read through them, and hopefully it'll help them in some shape or form. But yeah, Nisha, now we're sort of coming to the end of our session. I want you to maybe, give some lasting words, to our listeners about, especially what we've been talking about in terms of trauma. What would you like to leave them with today?
I think, firstly, you're not alone in it. I think a lot of people experience things that they just feel they can't talk about. It's too shameful. It's too heavy. Nobody wants to deal with this. I'm a burden. All of those narratives that we hold around trauma. I think the more conversations we start having about this, the better.
Yeah.
And the more we open it up, and the more we open up safe spaces to have these conversations, the more we're going to realize we're not alone. The more we're going to realize that a lot of people are holding a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And also that, again, trauma does not have to be a resting place.
Yeah.
We can heal. There's so many ways to heal, not just therapy. Yeah. Everyone has their own journey, and sometimes it includes therapy. Sometimes it includes other forms of therapy. There's so much out there now.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to really tap into that. I mean, there's trauma release exercises. There's somatic work that you can do with the body. Yoga is wonderful for releasing trauma. There's obviously mindfulness, breath work. There's a lot of things that you can do if you're not comfortable talking about it yet. Hopefully one day you will be, but I just feel like I want the listeners to know that there is so much that we can do together to figure it out, to heal from it, to move forward, to live a life of like abundance and joy, because that's what it takes.
Yeah.
Steals that from you. Ease, peace, abundance, joy.
Yeah.
We don't need to live in that fight or flight. And in the world that we're in now, like, we're so overstimulated, there's so much going on, we often feel forced to just move on without really dealing, sitting with, being with, allowing. So I think that's sort of what I want to leave them with today.
No, thank you for that. And I love the way you said, trauma doesn't need to be your resting place. Gosh, there's so many avenues to sort of process it and deal with it in your own time, in your own way. You get to create that path of healing for yourself. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope our listeners, will really take out of it and hopefully do something about it. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully you enjoyed this beginning of our trauma series, and there's much more to come. Thank you.